In this video, I'm going to cover what I believe will be one of the most significant decisions in modern day history and one that will have major implications on the global economy moving forward. And of course, I'm talking about the US creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve, and I think it's going to happen a lot sooner than people realize. Now, I highly encourage you to watch this video all the way through because I cannot stress to you enough how important this moment is. Now, to kick things off, I'm going to go back in history and talk about how the US dollar became the global reserve currency and the events leading up to where we are today, because it's critical to understand these underlying events to fully comprehend what's taking place right now. But before I get started, I have to remind you, nothing in this video is financial advice. You should always do your own research. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Now, starting off with a trip back to 1944, World War II was coming to an end, and the US and their allies knew that victory was secured. But the overall global economy was in shambles. The gold standard had been abandoned back in World War I, and as economies across the world were trying to find a balance with this new fiat system, international trade had come to a standstill. And this led to a meeting where the greatest economic minds from across the world came together with one common goal, and that was to restore a global economy using a currency that everyone could trust, one that could stabilize and reestablish international trade. And this meeting took place in a posh hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Now, while there were delegates present from 44 different countries, it really turned out to be a heavyweight bout between two economists in particular. The first you've likely heard of, a man by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And he was somewhat of a global celebrity when it came to economics. And he was there on behalf of Great Britain. And his ultimate goal was to come up with a resolution that wouldn't put the US in a position of power over the rest of the world. And his plan included the emergence or the creation of a brand new global currency that would be used for international trade. And there would be a new World Bank created that would oversee this new currency that would be headquartered in London. And on the other end is someone you may not have heard of. It's a man by the name of Harry Dexter White. And he was there on behalf of the US. And ultimately, his goal was to have the US dollar crowned as the new global reserve currency. He was very strategic about how he went about his plan, as he pushed for a gold convertible currency, or a currency that could be backed by gold. And when I say it was strategic, that's because most of the countries around the world had spent most of their gold to fund their war efforts. The US, on the other hand, was estimated to hold roughly 80% of the global gold supply at that time, making the US dollar a clear frontrunner to become this new gold convertible currency. And after 3 weeks of 18-hour days with excessive whiskey drinking and cigar smoking, Harry Dexter White did prevail, and the US dollar was crowned the new global reserve currency. And the way it would work is that countries around the world would hold US dollars to stabilize their economies and their individual currencies. And at any given time, central banks could turn in their US dollars or redeem them for gold at a set value of $35 an ounce. And from that point forward, the US dollar was used for global trade and was looked at as good as gold. And this worked really well, really up until the 1970s when things began to unravel. Now, Japan and the European countries had bounced back very well. In fact, their economies were booming, but the same could not be said for the US, as the Vietnam War had been very expensive and the economy was not doing so well and unemployment was on the rise. There were also growing concerns around the world that the US didn't actually have enough gold to back all the US dollars that were in circulation. And as it would turn out, these were valid concerns because while the US did have enough gold to back the US dollars that were in circulation within the US, the same could not be said for the US dollars that were in circulation outside of the US. As it was estimated that foreign central banks held roughly 14 billion US dollars, and the US only had about $3.2 billion worth of gold to back up those US dollars. And the concern, of course, was that countries around the world would stage a bank run and try to turn in all of their US dollars at the same time and expose the US for printing more money than they could actually back up. And this would have most certainly resulted in the collapse of the US dollar and the US economy. Now, Richard Nixon was the president at the time, and he was coming up on an election year and could not afford for the US economy to get any worse off than it already was. And obviously faced with a very difficult situation, he spoke to his advisors and made the decision on August 15th, 1971 to interrupt primetime television with 44 million Americans watching.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Effectively ending the Bretton Woods Agreement and the gold standard. Now, this would go down in history as the Nixon Shock, because while it was looked at favorably amongst people in the US and did get Nixon reelected, it sent shockwaves to countries around the world. Because keep in mind, they built their economies and stabilized their currencies around the US dollar, but more importantly, the gold backing of the US dollar. And Nixon had not given any of them a heads up that this announcement was coming, so they were completely caught off guard. And the next few months would consist of Nixon and his team trying to restore relations with the US allies. And they were successful, as the US and their allies agreed to a new, more equal global trade system, setting forth a new global financial system backed by fiat currencies that were no longer backed by gold, but instead the faith and the trust in the governments that were issuing these currencies. Now, there were obviously some major questions around whether the US dollar would keep its dominance on the global scale. But fortunately for the US, around that same time, OPEC, or the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, formed what's called the Petrodollar. And they decided that they were going to make the US dollar the backing for this petrodollar. And countries around the world would be required to use these petrodollars for international oil trade moving forward. And this essentially created global demand for the US dollar overnight, which re-entrenched it as the global reserve currency. Only this time there was a stark difference because there was no gold standard. And this basically gave the US an open checkbook or a credit card with no limit. And they certainly used that credit card as national debt in the US has risen to over $36 trillion today. But it also gave the US power over other countries in the form of sanctions that they can impose on them. And over the past few years, countries around the world have made it very clear they're fed up with both these sanctions and the reckless fiscal policy of the US. And that brings me to a coalition called BRICS Plus. Now, it actually started as BRIC in the early 2000s, standing for Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and became BRICS a few years later when South Africa joined the fold. And BRICS stayed dormant for a long time, but over the last few years, well, it's become BRICS Plus as they added new countries to the coalition. And it's gone from a mere idea to really a full-on movement at this point. And just a couple of months ago, they had their 16th annual summit in Kazan, Russia. And this summit is being characterized by many as a modern-day Bretton Woods, only this time the U.S. obviously doesn't have a seat at the table. And there were some key takeaways from this annual summit. The first is that it wasn't just the BRICS Plus countries in attendance, as there were representatives from 36 different countries present. And they are expanding. In fact, this is a list of countries that have either expressed interest or formally applied to join BRICS Plus at this point. Now, they also made it very clear that their number one priority right now is to de-dollarize or reduce the reliance on the US dollar. And the wheels are already in motion here as they've started to settle international trade in their own currencies. In fact, Putin came out recently and stated that about 95% of the trade between Russia and China at this point is done in their own currencies, in rubles and the yuan. But there have still been some challenges there because the international payment system that is traditionally used, SWIFT, relies on our traditional banking system. And while their trade may start in rubles and end in, the Chinese yuan, in many cases, the US dollar is still used to facilitate that trade. The SWIFT payment system is also what the US tends to use to impose sanctions. For example, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US imposed sanctions on Russia and cut off 7 of their biggest banks from using the SWIFT payment system. But they are addressing these hurdles because China just introduced a new payment system outside of SWIFT. And of course, this payment system would allow countries like Russia to circumvent sanctions that the US normally impose through SWIFT. And they're also looking at blockchain technology to settle payments. And more specifically, they're looking at a blockchain solution called mBridge. Now, it remains to be seen if this is the payment system that they end up implementing. But they're making it very clear that they intend to use a payment system outside of SWIFT in order to circumvent US sanctions and use blockchain technology to settle payments outside of the traditional banking system, which in essence would allow them to settle payments without having to rely on the US dollar. But the most important development from this summit, I would say, is that they're talking about introducing a new BRICS Plus currency that's backed by gold and Bitcoin. And this should sound familiar because it's not much different than the idea that John Maynard Keynes had presented back in 1944. Now, while I don't think that any other country's fiat currency has any chance of supplanting the US dollar, a new currency like this that is backed by gold and Bitcoin, that is a serious threat. And it is starting to get attention. In fact, just this past week, Trump came out and stated that if BRICS decides to form a new currency, he will impose 100% tariffs on these countries. And that brings us to where we are right now. And I have to say, in having conversations with people specifically in the US, there's this arrogance and this sentiment that the US dollar can never be supplanted as the global reserve currency. But I think we need to have a bit of a reality check here. Because this global fiat system, or experiment really, that started with the Nixon Shock back in 1971, has only been in place for around 50 years, which in the grand scheme of things is not really a long time. And the experiment is failing. When you look at inflation around the world and the money printing and the national debt, I mean, look at this chart of the US national debt. We're adding roughly $1 trillion to our debt every 100 days. And the interest payments on our debt alone are about $1 trillion a year. That's roughly 25% of the total tax revenue that the US brings in on an annual basis going to interest payments on our debt alone. This is not sustainable. So the real question is, where do we go from here? Well, it's important to note that the US is still in the driver's seat for now, because the US dollar is still the global reserve currency. And as far as we know, the US actually holds more Bitcoin than any other country, at least for now, with just over 213,000 Bitcoin. That said, if they want to stay in the driver's seat, I believe they need to act quickly. And that brings me to two scenarios that I can see playing out moving forward. The first is that the US continues with business as usual and threatens these BRICS plus countries with these 100% tariffs and opts out of creating this strategic Bitcoin reserve as the US national debt spirals out of control. And I would expect these BRICS plus countries to play nice from an optics standpoint and refrain from making any official announcement or any set timeline in launching this new currency while they accumulate gold and Bitcoin. And it would make sense for them to go this route because making any official announcement around this would absolutely push up the price of gold and Bitcoin, making it much more difficult for them to accumulate. And they have been accumulating, by the way, as it's rumored that Russia has been front-running the US in buying Bitcoin. Brazil just came out last week and also announced that they're planning on moving 5% of their reserves into Bitcoin. China is also rumored to be buying Bitcoin. And when it comes to the new countries that have joined BRICS Plus, well, check this out.
While we were all hyperventilating about the election over the last week, BRICS had a conference in Russia. There's 6 new members of BRICS this year. So BRICS GDP is now greater than the combined GDP of G7. Of the 6 new members, 3 of them, Argentina, the UAE, and Ethiopia, are now mining Bitcoin with government resources. So there's tremendous urgency outside of the U.S. to find a way to circumvent the irresponsible fiscal policy that we've been running here in the U.S. In fact, Russia announced an initiative. Their sovereign wealth fund is going to invest in a regional initiative to build Bitcoin mining and AI infrastructure throughout BRICS with an idea of settling global trade in Bitcoin.
So there's no doubt that these countries are accumulating. And under this scenario, once they have enough gold and Bitcoin to back this new currency, they would launch it. So what do you think these countries are going to do that have been up to this point forced to hold US dollars for international trade? The US dollar that continues to endlessly be printed and the national debt that is spiraling out of control versus this new BRICS Plus currency that has actual value backing it in gold and Bitcoin. Well, they're going to start abandoning the US dollar and dumping US treasuries. And well, the US is likely going to be the last one standing to buy them. And as the US dollar loses dominance, well, that credit card that we've had, consider that canceled. And this is really worst case nightmare situation for the US and one that they cannot afford. And so that brings me to scenario number 2. And that, of course, is that the US does decide to create this strategic Bitcoin reserve. And as that plan stands today, that would look like the US buying an additional 1 million Bitcoin over the next 4 to 5 years, bringing their total holdings to roughly 1.2 million Bitcoin, which would be about 5.7% of the total 21 million Bitcoin that will ever exist. Now, what do you think is going to happen if this announcement is made? We're going to see a mad rush to buy Bitcoin from countries around the world, states, institutions. In fact, we're already seeing this. And I think a lot of that is because there is an assumption that this is going to happen. In fact, Swiss lawmakers came out just this week calling for a strategic Bitcoin reserve, stating that the window to be faster than BRICS in the US is closing quickly. It's estimated that there's going to be 10 US states that announce strategic reserves in the next couple of months. On the institutional side, obviously, Tesla has been a Bitcoin holder for a while, but Michael Saylor of MicroStrategy just had his second meeting with Microsoft's board to discuss adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet. And it's rumored that Amazon is looking to add as much as $250 million worth of Bitcoin by the end of the year. Now, I don't know that Microsoft or Amazon will move forward with this measure in this go around, but the fact that they're even assessing it at all is very telling. And that's not even mentioning the demand from individuals and what we're seeing with the ETF situation with BlackRock and Fidelity. And well, news just broke that Goldman Sachs with $3 trillion under asset management is looking at offering Bitcoin services. There are experts that are predicting that Bitcoin will hit $500,000 within the next 5 years if this strategic reserve is announced. And I would argue that this would actually be a very good thing for the US. Because if the price of Bitcoin climbs, at the very least, it's going to delay BRICS Plus in creating their new currency. Because it's going to make it much more difficult for these countries to accumulate. And for the US, well, the US dollar is the global reserve currency. We have the buying power to buy Bitcoin at higher prices if we need to. The same cannot be said for some of these other countries. And I would argue that this could actually completely eliminate the threat, because their strategic advantage right now is that they're going to form this currency using Bitcoin to back it. Well, if the US can put themselves in a position to be the largest holder of Bitcoin, that really throws water on their plans. And countries around the world won't be as incentivized to leave the US dollar for this other currency. But there is one other benefit I want to touch on as far as their strategic reserve goes. And this is something that Trump has talked about, and Senator Cindy Loomis has mentioned several times recently, and that is that a strategic Bitcoin reserve could wipe out roughly half of our national debt of $36 trillion over the next 20 years. And I think it is important to bring this up because it actually gives us insight into where the government thinks the price of Bitcoin can go. Because let's do some simple math. Let's say that we do add 1 million Bitcoin, bringing our total holdings to 1.2 million Bitcoin. Well, if you multiply that by the current price of Bitcoin, let's just call it 100,000 to make it a round number, that's roughly $120 billion. That's a far cry from half of our national debt of $36 trillion. So what would the price need to be in order to wipe out half of the national debt today? Well, you take $18 trillion, half of $36 trillion, divide that by 1.2 million Bitcoin. That comes out to roughly $15 million per Bitcoin, which is really interesting because if you look at what Michael Saylor's projections are over the next 21 years, he's not far off from that projection as he's calling for a $13 million Bitcoin, and he's not the only one. Now, it is important to note that for us to actually cut our national debt in half over the next 20 years, that is also assuming that we wouldn't add to our national debt, which I frankly find very hard to believe considering we haven't had a budget surplus since back in 2001. And for us to actually have a budget surplus at this point, it would likely require us to not only drastically cut spending, but also increase tax revenue, which would be a very unpopular policy for any sitting president. But when you consider what the actual cost of this insurance policy would be, I do believe that it would be a net positive on our national debt. Because breaking down the math here, obviously if the US makes this announcement, they're not going to be able to purchase Bitcoin at current prices. But using that projection of $500,000 over the next 5 years, let's say their average cost across these million Bitcoin that they plan to acquire is $300,000. Well, that's a $300 billion insurance policy. Now, I know that sounds like a big number, but when you consider that it's less than 1% of our national debt and that we've passed multiple trillion-dollar bills since COVID, well, all of a sudden that number doesn't seem so big anymore. And when you consider the fact that this $300 billion insurance policy could at the very least delay BRICS Plus in launching this new currency and potentially eliminate the threat altogether, I don't think that it necessarily matters whether it's half of our national debt or a fourth of our national debt. But maybe the bigger point here is that the damage or the cost of doing nothing is frankly immeasurable. And it's for those reasons that I believe the US is going to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I do believe it's to the advantage of the US to make this happen sooner than later. And I would not at all be surprised if Trump actually does this with an executive order after he's inaugurated. So what does this mean for you and me? Well, I can tell you what I'm not going to do, and that is I'm not going to fumble what I foresee as the biggest wealth generation opportunity of our lifetime. And as such, I've been accumulating. I'm going to continue accumulating. And I don't believe it'll be long before being a whole coiner, owning a full Bitcoin will put you in very rare company. And we'll soon be talking about fractional Bitcoin in the form of sats or satoshis. But I fully intend to seize the opportunity in front of me. And I hope that at the very least, this video has brought awareness to you of what is taking place right now in the global economy, so you can do your research and decide what the best path forward is for you. And with that said, as always, I appreciate your viewership. If you haven't subscribed already, please do so. Signing off, this is Bradley Meyer with the DePIN Connection.